The cobblestones beneath your feet are slick with something you try not to identify. This is the butcher row, the pulsating, pungent heart of every medieval town. By the end of this story, you will understand how these streets of blood and sawdust shaped civilization itself. We will uncover why butchers were both powerful kings and social outcasts, and what dark secrets might have been carved up alongside the meat. What does the way a society organizes its most unpleasant necessities reveal about its true character? That overpowering smell was your first clue to the invisible map of the medieval world. Every town was built around a central marketplace, a chaotic symphony of commerce that was the true lifeblood of the community. This was not a random collection of stalls. It was a meticulously organized ecosystem, governed by powerful guilds. These guilds were more than trade unions. They were the keepers of secrets, the setters of prices, and the enforcers of quality. A carpenter would never set up his bench next to a blacksmith's roaring forge, and a silversmith would not want his fine work dusted with the flour from the baker next door. So, by an unspoken yet strict rule, trades clustered together. You had the street of the goldsmiths, gleaming with precious metal, the lane of the weavers, clattering with looms. The square of the spice merchants, where the air was thick with cinnamon and pepper. This was zoning, centuries before the term existed, a practical solution to noise, fire risk, and competition. But one trade always ended up pushed to the very edge, both of the marketplace and of polite society. Their street was not defined by a gleam or a clatter, but by a scent that carried for blocks. So we must ask, why did the butchers, providers of a fundamental food, end up segregated into their own notorious, isolated row? The answer begins with the most basic and brutal of human needs, sanitation. Think of a single butcher at work. The process was not clean. It was a cascade of blood, a pile of entrails, and a mountain of bones. The sounds alone, the final cries and the thud of the cleaver, were enough to mark a space as separate. But it was the smell that truly defined it, a thick, metallic, and deeply organic odor that clung to the air and the very stones. Now multiply that by a dozen butchers, all working from dawn, slaughtering multiple animals every single day. The byproduct was staggering. Gallons of blood needed to drain, great heaps of offal. The internal organs, not always fit for human consumption, had to go somewhere. If every butcher operated from his own home scattered throughout the town, the result would have been catastrophic. Waste would seep into the communal wells, poisoning the drinking water. Blood would run down every alley, attracting swarms of flies and rats, the carriers of disease. The stench would be inescapable, permeating every home and market stall. So the town's leaders, driven by a very practical horror, made a simple decree. All of this must happen in one place. They designated a specific street, often the one already informally used by the trade, and made it official. This street, the Butcher Row, was almost always chosen with careful geography. It was typically on the edge of the main marketplace, downstream from the town's primary water source. Better yet, it was built along a riverbank or a sturdy stream. The water served a dual purpose. It provided the butchers with a ready supply for cleaning their tools and tables. More importantly, it acted as a natural sewer. The daily deluge of blood, waste, and wash water could be channeled directly into the current and carried away. In this light, the Butcher Row was not a punishment, but a public health innovation. It was a containment zone for the messiness of life, a sacrifice of one street to protect the cleanliness of all the others. This logical arrangement solved one problem, but in doing so, it created a powerful and lasting social symbol. But this concentration of butchers in one row created something far more powerful than a simple sanitation district. It forged a fortress of trade. From this shared street arose one of the most formidable institutions in the medieval town, the Butchers' Guild. Think of this not as a simple club, but as a private government for the meat trade. Its power was absolute. The guild set the standards for everything. How fresh must the meat be? What constituted a fair weight for a penny's worth of beef? They decided. They controlled the prices, ensuring no undercutting butcher could start a price war that would hurt them all. They managed the precious flow of knowledge through apprenticeships. deciding who could learn the trade and who could not. This was a closed shop, and the guild held the only key. Having every single butcher operating on the same street was their ultimate strategic advantage. Supervision was constant and effortless. A guild master could walk the row and see, with a single glance, if anyone was selling substandard meat or using dishonest scales. Collective action, like agreeing to raise prices or refusing to sell until a town law was changed, could be organized in minutes. They could literally stand together, a united front of bloodied aprons and cleavers. This monopoly over a fundamental human need, protein, made them incredibly wealthy and politically connected. They were often among the town's leading citizens, loaning money to the council and funding public works. Yet they lived and worked in the most reviled part of town, a contradiction that would stain their reputation for centuries. This street had a name, and that name tells you everything. In England, they called it the shambles, a word that originally meant the bench or stall where meat was displayed, but came to mean a scene of utter chaos. And its location was never an accident. If you were to draw a map of a medieval town, plotting the Butcher Row was a precise calculation of wind, water, and social standing. First, consider the wind. Town planners, even in an age without formal urban design, understood prevailing weather patterns. The Butcher Row was almost always placed downwind of the main market square and the residential quarters. This was a deliberate act of olfactory defense. When the breeze picked up, it would carry the stench of blood and offal away from the delicate noses of the spice merchants and the wealthy patrons, sending it instead out over the fields or the river. Next, water was the critical partner. A river or a fast-flowing stream was not just a convenience for the butchers. It was the town's primary waste management system. The daily torrent of blood, wash water, and discarded scraps would be sluiced directly into the current. You can almost hear the constant, grim trickle running between the cobblestones, a red-tinged stream finding its way to the riverbank. This geographical exile served a dual purpose. Practically, it contained a massive public health hazard. Socially, it reinforced a powerful hierarchy. In the center of the market, you found the clean, quiet, and valuable trades. The goldsmith with his tiny scales and gleaming work, the silversmith, the scribe. Their businesses dealt in permanence and beauty. At the edge, literally and figuratively, was the butcher, whose trade dealt in death, decay, and the temporary. His product, though essential, was a reminder of the mortal, messy nature of life itself. By placing the shambles on the periphery, the town was making a statement about what it valued and what it wished to keep at arm's length. It was a zoning of not just trades, but of concepts, separating the refined from the raw, the eternal from the perishable. Yet in this exile, the butchers built a kingdom of their own, one whose power was rooted in something far darker than location. The architecture of the Butcher Row was a brutal and honest reflection of the work itself. Step up to one of these open-fronted shops. There are no walls to hide the process, only a wide counter facing the street. This counter is not a simple table. It is the shamble, a massive, solid block of wood, often oak, stained a permanent, deep crimson from years of use. It is thick enough to withstand the constant hammering of cleavers, a surface where the final transformation from animal to commodity took place in full public view. Above this block of blood and business, you would see the true spectacle. Heavy wooden beams span the narrow street, creating a canopy of meat. From these beams hang iron hooks, and from these hooks swing the carcasses, whole sides of beef, entire pigs, and rows of lambs. This overhead rail system was the butcher's inventory and his advertisement. It showed the town he had stock. It allowed the meat to cool in the open air, and it kept the valuable product safely out of reach of the dogs and rats that scuttled below. But the most ingenious design was often hidden beneath your feet. Many of these shops had a secret, a cellar dug directly under the street. This subterranean room, accessed by a trapdoor behind the counter, was the medieval version of cold storage. The earth and stone kept the temperature consistently cool, far cooler than the shop above. Here, the butchers could store larger cuts, salt barrels of meat for preservation, or hang particularly valuable game. This was rudimentary refrigeration, using the constant, cool mass of the ground itself to slow decay. Every single feature, from the open front for display and customer interaction, to the overhead rails for airflow and security, to the cellar for temperature control, was born from pure, unadorned function. This was architecture without pretense, built for one purpose, to efficiently manage death and turn it into daily sustenance. And in this open-air theater of blood and trade, the butcher himself played a role that made him a figure of profound contradiction. The row awoke not with a sunrise, but with a scream. Each day began in the pre-dawn gloom, the air already thick with the scent of damp straw and animal fear. The first sound to pierce the quiet was not a human voice, but the panicked bleating of a sheep, or the low, confused groan of an ox being led down the narrow lane. This was the overture to a daily symphony of slaughter, a brutal and necessary performance that fed the entire town. You would hear the heavy thud of a wooden mallet, a moment of silence, and then the swift, slick sound of the knife. The cobblestones, still dark with yesterday's residue, would soon run fresh with rivulets of crimson, channeled toward the central gutter. By mid-morning, the row was a frenzy of orchestrated chaos. The dominant sound was the percussive rhythm of cleavers, a constant, solid thwack-thwack whack as carcasses were reduced to recognizable cuts. Over this beat rose the voices of the butchers themselves, loud and booming as they called out prices to the gathered crowd. A penny for a shank of mutton, tuppence for a fine piece of pork loin. Customers haggled, apprentices shouted as they hauled new sides of meat from the cellars, and stray dogs barked at the edges, hoping for a tossed scrap. The air was a layered tapestry of smells. The metallic tang of fresh blood mixed with the earthy scent of sawdust scattered to soak up the mess, and beneath it all, the faint, sweet odor of fat and raw meat. The sights were just as vivid. Above you, the canopy of carcasses swayed slightly, a forest of meat. Below, the butchers worked with a speed and precision born of lifelong practice. An apprentice might be tasked with sweeping the ever-growing pile of bones and offal into a waiting barrel, while another carefully washed down the great wooden block, only for it to be stained again moments later. This was not a job for the squeamish. Hands and forearms were permanently nicked and scarred, aprons were stiff with dried blood, and a certain hardened demeanor was the uniform of the trade. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon, until the last customer had gone and the hooks began to look bare. As the sun began to lower, the symphony shifted to its final movement, cleanup. The remaining scraps were collected. The tools, knives and cleavers and saws were meticulously scrubbed and sharpened for the next day. The worst of the waste was hauled away, often by the apprentices, to be dumped into the river or carted to the town's fringe. Water was sluiced across the stones in great buckets, turning the street into a temporary, pink-tinged stream. Slowly, the cacophony faded, leaving behind a damp, heavy quiet, and that enduring, deep-seated smell embedded in the very timber and stone. The row slept, but its presence lingered, a silent testament to the hard, visceral truth that kept the town alive. And within this daily grind of blood and business, the butcher himself occupied a social position of startling contradiction. The hooks above the butcher's stall told a story of their own. While a side of beef was a common sight, the variety of meat was a direct reflection of medieval life's rhythms and rigid structures. The wealthy lord might send his gamekeeper to the row for a prized haunch of venison, a symbol of his exclusive hunting rights. For the common townsfolk, pork was a staple, with every part of the pig used, from the hams to the trotters. Mutton from older sheep provided a stronger flavored, cheaper option, and goat meat was not uncommon. Over in a corner, a basket might hold recently slaughtered chickens, ducks, or geese, their feathers still drifting in the air, a more affordable source of protein for a family's pot. But this marketplace was not static. It pulsed with the seasons and bowed to the powerful dictates of the church. In the cold months, you would see more pork, as autumn was the traditional time for slaughtering pigs before they needed winter feed. Spring might bring younger, tender lamb, and then came Lent, the 40 days of fasting before Easter. During this time, the church forbade the eating of meat from land animals. The butcher row would grow strangely quiet, its daily symphony muted. The butchers themselves might switch to selling preserved meats they had salted earlier, or they simply waited. In their place, the fishmongers' stalls would swell with prominence, offering herring, cod, and eels to a population observing holy law. This religious calendar forced a dramatic, predictable shift in the town's entire diet and economy. Nothing on the butcher's block was wasted. After the prime cuts were sold, the true economy of scraps began. The offal, the internal organs like liver, heart, kidneys, and tripe, was packaged up for the poorest customers or for use in hearty, filling pies and puddings. The blood was carefully collected for black pudding. The fat, rendered down in great pots, became tallow, the key ingredient for the candles that lit homes and streets after dark. This tallow trade connected the butcher directly to the chandlers, and the hides, the skins of the animals, were perhaps the most valuable byproduct of all. They were sold to the tanners, who would begin the long, foul-smelling process of turning them into leather for shoes, belts, armor, and saddles. A single animal's value was thus multiplied across multiple guilds and trades, its life sustaining the town in a dozen different forms. This intricate web of use reveals a society operating on a principle of absolute necessity, where efficiency was born not from technology, but from sheer need. And this very efficiency, this total utilization of the animal, placed the butcher at the center of a hidden network that connected his bloody stall to every corner of medieval life, and even to the shadowy edges of the law. Yet this wealth and power existed within a cage of profound social contempt. The butcher was a necessary pariah, a man both relied upon and reviled. His hands were permanently stained, not just with blood, but with the metaphysical taint of death itself. In the medieval mind, deeply shaped by religion and the concept of the great chain of being, there was a clear hierarchy to creation. At the top was God, then angels, then kings and nobles, down through the common man, to animals, and finally to plants and stones. Each link had its proper place and purpose. The butcher's work violently transgressed this natural order. He did not just handle animals, he actively dismantled them, breaking apart God's living creatures for profit. His daily life was an immersion in blood, a substance associated with violence, sin, and corruption. This made him spiritually unclean in the eyes of many, a permanent outsider to the community of the pure. You could buy his meat, but you might not want his daughter to marry your son. This stigma had real-world consequences. In some towns, butchers were barred from holding certain high civic offices, no matter how much money they donated. They could be excluded from the most prestigious social circles and religious fraternities. Their testimony in court was sometimes considered less trustworthy than that of a farmer or a mason. They lived in a paradox of their own making, inhabiting the most valuable real estate on the social map, the provider of a fundamental need, while being morally quarantined to its lowest corner. Their guild hall might be grand, but the whispers followed them inside. This tension created a unique psychology. To survive, butchers often turned inward, fostering an intense loyalty to their own kind. Marriages were arranged within butchering families, strengthening their economic network and creating dynasties of the trade. They developed their own slang, their own customs, a thick culture of solidarity that acted as a shield against the judgmental stares from the cleaner end of the market square. They became a tribe within the town, bound by shared secrets, shared smells, and a shared understanding that the world needed what they did, even as it pretended not to see how it was done. So the next time you walk that imagined row, look past the hanging carcasses and the flowing gutters. See the man behind the block, navigating a world that paid him well, but would never truly let him in. His story is one of the oldest conflicts, the clash between practical necessity and social purity. And this very conflict, this uncomfortable bargain, would lead his trade into a shadow far darker than any cellar. The butcher's intimate knowledge of anatomy and disposal made him a figure of whispered suspicion. In the shadows of that noisy, bloody row, a darker rumor could take root. What if a butcher, so skilled at carving flesh and making unwanted parts vanish into the river, was asked to apply his craft to something other than a pig or a cow? The very efficiency that made the row a public health necessity also made it a perfect front for secrets. Consider the practical horrors. The constant clamor of the cleavers drowned out other sounds. The flowing gutters washed away more than animal blood. The cellar, that cool, hidden space beneath the street, could hold more than sides of beef. In a world without forensic science, where a missing person might simply vanish, the butcher's trade offered a grim and terrifying possibility for making evidence disappear entirely. This connected them, in the public imagination, to the criminal underworld. A thief needing to dispose of a weapon might know a man on the row. Worse still were the tales that linked butchers to the ghouls of the graveyard, the body snatchers. In an age when medical schools desperately needed cadavers for study, and the only legal supply was the corpses of executed criminals, a black market for the dead flourished. Who better to understand how to quickly and quietly dismember a body than a man who did it every day? A butcher's cart, seen rumbling through the dark streets before dawn, might not be carrying animal offal to the dump. It was a perfect cover. These rumors were rarely proven, but they persisted because they made a dreadful kind of sense. The butcher lived already in a moral gray zone, stained by death and separated from the community. If he could carve a sheep, why not a man? If he could sell a kidney from a pig, what was to stop him from selling something else? This was the ultimate social fear, that the man who sustained life could also secretly facilitate murder. It transformed the Butcher Row from a simple marketplace into a place of latent menace, where the accepted chaos could hide true malevolence. The public's reliance on the butcher was therefore laced with a deep, unspoken anxiety. You bought his meat, but you never truly turned your back on him. The stench was a living entity, a wall of rot that announced the row long before you saw it. This was the daily reality of the butcher's trade, a relentless war against decay fought on streets that were never truly clean. While the Central River gutter carried away the worst of the blood, the true sanitation nightmare lay in the solid waste. Great heaps of offal, the intestines, lungs, and other organs not fit for sale, would pile up in barrels or corners. In the summer heat, this material could begin to putrefy in a matter of hours, becoming a seething, maggot-ridden mass. The smell was beyond description, a sweet, cloying, and profoundly nauseating odor that clung to the back of your throat. This rotting bounty acted as a dinner bell for every scavenger in the town. Rats grew fat and bold, scurrying between the stalls in broad daylight. Clouds of flies, carriers of typhoid and dysentery, bred in the offal and then traveled to the bread stalls and fruit carts, contaminating the entire market. Packs of semi-wild dogs roamed the area, fighting over scraps and posing a threat to children and livestock alike. The Butcher Row was not just a place of business, it was the epicenter of the town's public health crisis, a petri dish of pestilence waiting to spill into every home. Town councils were not blind to this danger. They passed ordinance after ordinance, trying to impose order on the chaos. Butchers were commanded to keep their frontages clean. They were required to dispose of all offal and waste outside the town walls by sundown each day. Specific times were set for slaughtering, often only in the early morning, to limit the time blood and guts sat in the sun. Fines were levied for those who left entrails in the street or allowed their waste barrels to overflow. The problem was enforcement, who wanted the job of policing the butchers, a powerful and tight-knit guild. The constables themselves likely lived downstream and had to endure the consequences of lax oversight, and so, the rules were often ignored or loosely interpreted. A butcher might technically haul his waste away, but only as far as the nearest riverbank just outside the town, where it would fester and pollute the water supply anyway. The battle against the stench was constant and largely futile. Herbs like lavender and rosemary were sometimes scattered on the floors of shops, and lime was used to try and mask the odor, but these were mere gestures against an overwhelming biological force. The reality was that medieval towns lacked the infrastructure for true sanitation. There was no daily garbage collection, no deep-bury landfill, no understanding of germ theory. They were fighting symptoms, not the disease itself. So the row remained a necessary evil, a buzzing, stinking, vital organ that kept the town alive while simultaneously poisoning it. This grim compromise defined urban life for centuries, a daily reminder that survival was messy, dangerous, and smelled unmistakably of blood and decay. That central gutter, known as the kennel, was the row's true artery. It was a shallow trench carved directly into the cobblestones, running straight down the middle of the street. From dawn until dusk, It carried a sluggish, pink-tinged stream, a mixture of wash water, animal blood, and liquefied waste from 100 cleaning buckets. This was not an occasional flow. It was a permanent river of offal, trickling its way toward the town's main water source. The destination was almost always the same, the nearest river or stream. This was the medieval solution, out of sight, out of mind. The butchers simply sluiced the physical evidence of their trade into the current, believing the moving water would dilute and carry it all away. For the town, it solved an immediate, overwhelming problem. For everyone and everything downstream, it created a slow-moving disaster. Think of the river not as a natural feature, but as the town's sewer. By the time the kennel's contents reached it, the water was already transformed. The constant influx of blood and organic matter robbed the river of its oxygen. Fish would float belly up along the banks, killed by the sudden biological demand placed on their home. The water itself took on a foul, metallic taste and a strange, cloudy hue. This was the drinking water for the next town downstream. It was the water used for washing clothes, for watering livestock, and often, in desperation, for cooking. Complaints from these neighboring communities were among the earliest recorded environmental protests in history. Town councils would receive angry missives, petitions demanding that the upstream butchers stop poisoning the shared waterway. Sometimes, these disputes escalated into legal battles or even threats of violence between towns. The Butcher's Row, in its daily function, was committing a form of industrial-scale pollution centuries before the factory chimney was invented. Their waste was an unavoidable byproduct of feeding a concentrated population, and the river bore the silent, toxic cost. The consequences rippled outward in unexpected ways. Tanners who needed clean water to soak hides would find their own downstream operations compromised. Brewers who relied on pure water for their ale faced ruined batches. The very idea of public health was contradicted by this single, accepted practice. A town might forbid the dumping of waste within its own walls, yet cheerfully channel it all into a river that served its neighbors. This was the paradox of medieval environmental thinking, local cleanliness achieved through exported filth. The kennel, that simple groove in the stone, was a physical manifestation of a narrow worldview, where a problem was considered solved once it left your own street, regardless of where it went next. It connected the butcher's block directly to sickness in another community, a chain of cause and effect that remained invisible to most, but was felt by all who lived along the wounded river. The butcher's control over the animal did not end at the meat. His monopoly on slaughter granted him power over the very first link in a vast economic chain, and the other guilds downstream were not always willing to pay his price. The most bitter and enduring feud was with the tanners. A butcher could sell his freshly stripped hides to any tanner he chose, and this gave him tremendous leverage. The tanners, whose owned foul-smelling vats of urine and tannin placed them just a rung above butchers on the social ladder, desperately needed a steady supply. A butcher might suddenly raise his prices, or worse, sell an entire week's worth of hides to a single favored tanner, leaving the others idle and unable to fulfill their own orders for leather. This could spark price wars, sabotage, and even physical brawls between the apprentices of the two trades. Town councils were constantly dragged into these disputes, forced to mediate like parents breaking up a fight between two quarrelsome children, each accusing the other of greed and bad faith. The conflict laid bare a raw economic truth. The person who controls the raw material holds the ultimate power, and the butcher, standing at the very beginning of the process, held everyone else hostage. A quieter but equally tense rivalry simmered with the fishmongers. For most of the year, the fishmonger was a secondary figure, his stall tucked away, his product a supplement. But during the 40 days of Lent, the entire social order of the marketplace flipped. With the consumption of red meat forbidden by the church, fish became the only permissible source of animal protein. Suddenly, the fishmonger was king. His stall swelled in size and prominence, often encroaching on the now quiet butcher row. His prices, freed from competition, could soar. For the butchers, this was a month of lost income and bruised pride. They watched their domain grow quiet, while the fishmongers grew rich on religious law. Some butchers tried to bend the rules, selling expensive, preserved meats or arguing that certain fowl were, technically, fish. Others simply seethed, counting the days until Easter Sunday, when they could reclaim their economic throne. This annual shift created a deep, cyclical resentment, a reminder that even their powerful guild was subject to forces greater than any town council. Then there was the battle over the kitchen. Butchers sold raw meat. That was their privilege, their licensed domain. But what happened when a cook or a pie maker bought that meat, cooked it into a savory pasty, and then sold the finished product from their own shop? In the eyes of the Butchers' Guild, this was theft. They saw it as the cooks stealing their customers and profiting from their labor. The Cooks' Guild, however, argued they were creating an entirely new product, a service of convenience and skill that the butchers did not provide. These disputes over value-added goods would erupt into legal battles that could last for years. Town records are filled with petitions from butchers demanding that cooks be forbidden from selling any dish containing meat, and counter-petitions from cooks arguing for their right to practice their art. It was a fight over the very definition of a trade's boundaries. Could a barber who set a broken bone be accused of stealing work from a surgeon? Could a carpenter who made a wheel infringe on the wheelwright? The conflict between the butcher and the cook was the medieval version of this same struggle, a messy, ongoing negotiation over where one profession ended and another began. Each skirmish, whether over hides, fish, or hot pies, reveals the medieval marketplace not as a harmonious community, but as a political arena where every guild was a faction, constantly jockeying for advantage, protecting its turf, and using every tool, from monopoly to litigation to intimidation, to secure its piece of a very finite pie. But behind the blood-stained apron could lie a fortune. For a master butcher who navigated the guild's politics and controlled a prime stall on the row, the wealth was very real and very visible. This was a cash business, dealing in a product everyone needed every single day. The most successful butchers lived in a stark contradiction, inhabiting the town's smelliest street while building homes that rivaled those of merchants and knights. Their houses, often located at the cleaner end of the butcher row, or just off its perimeter, were built of fine timber and stone, with multiple stories and glazed windows, a luxury that announced their success to anyone walking by. They dressed the part, too, on Sundays. A master butcher might shed his work clothes for a robe of imported wool, trimmed with fur, with a heavy gold chain around his neck and a ring on his finger. This was not just vanity, it was a deliberate statement. It screamed that the filth of his trade did not define him, that the money earned in blood could buy the trappings of respectability. The most spectacular display of this wealth, however, was not in the home or on the back, but at the table. The Butchers' Guild feast was legendary. Imagine a hall filled with long tables groaning under the weight of food, but not just any food. This was a deliberate, extravagant performance of abundance. There would be roast peacocks presented with their feathers fanned, whole roasted boars with apples in their mouths, and pies so large they could hold entire flocks of birds. The meat, of course, was the finest they had, prepared by the best cooks money could hire. It was a carnival of consumption, a way for the guild to show the town that they controlled the very symbol of prosperity itself. For one night, they were not the outcasts of the shambles, but the lords of the feast, hosting town officials and clergy in a cloud of roasting fat and spiced wine. This lavish spending served a deeper, more anxious purpose. The wealth felt tainted, stained by its source. To cleanse it, and perhaps their family's name, successful butchers became some of the town's most generous patrons. They funded the construction of church chapels, donated stained glass windows depicting saints, often with a discreet image of a lamb or ox in the corner to mark the donor's trade, and left money in their wills to feed the poor. This was philanthropy as penance, an attempt to launder a fortune earned in blood through acts of holy charity. The most ambitious families went further, using their substantial dowries to marry their daughters into the landed gentry, families who needed cash but had a respectable lineage. A country knight with a crumbling manor might hold his nose and accept a butcher's daughter, her father's gold funding the repair of his roof and the purchase of new horses. In this way, the butcher's coin, earned in the gritty reality of the row, could slowly seep into the veins of the aristocracy, buying a future generation a cleaner name. It was a quiet, relentless social climb, proving that in the medieval world, even the most potent stigmas could eventually be overpowered by the weight of pure, undeniable wealth. A boy's life on the butcher row began not with a knife, but with a broom. For a young apprentice, perhaps only 12 or 13 years old, the dream of one day wielding the master's cleaver was a distant star, obscured by the daily fog of menial labor. His first years were a baptism in filth. He was the one who swept the ever-growing piles of bone and sawdust from the shop floor. He was sent to fetch water, heavy buckets slung from a yoke across his narrow shoulders, making trip after trip from the well or the river's edge. His most constant, grim task was dealing with the offal. He would haul the reeking barrels of entrails through the streets, under the mocking gaze of other apprentices and the complaints of housewives, to dump them at the designated spot outside the town walls. His hands were raw from scrubbing the great wooden block, his back ached, and the pervasive smell of blood and decay became the very scent of his youth. This was not cruelty, but the foundation of the trade. It tested his resilience, his obedience, and his stomach. It taught him the rhythm of the row, the flow of waste and product, and the absolute necessity of order amidst the chaos. If he could survive this, and many did not, he might be allowed to step closer to the craft. After years of proving his mettle, the apprentice would graduate from cleaner to assistant. Now he was permitted to hold an animal steady, to learn the precise points for a swift, humane kill. He practiced on smaller creatures first, chickens and geese, mastering the quick turn of the wrist. The first time he was handed the killing knife for a sheep or a pig was a solemn, terrifying moment. A botched slaughter was not just messy, it was wasteful and sinful, a poor end for a valuable creature. Under the master's watchful, critical eye, he learned the anatomy, where to cut to drain the blood fastest, how to hoist the carcass onto the rail. This stage was as much about psychology as skill. He had to harden himself to the sounds and the sights to cultivate a necessary detachment. The work was physically brutal. He developed powerful shoulders and forearms from handling heavy sides of meat. His hands became a map of nicks and scars, each one a lesson learned. He memorized the different cuts, the names for each joint and muscle, learning which were for roasting and which were for stewing. The master's knowledge was a guarded treasure, doled out in fragments, and the apprentice had to be attentive, quiet, and endlessly useful to earn each new piece. If he persevered for 7 long years, a transformation awaited. The guild would examine his skills and his character. Had he paid his fees? Had he caused no scandals? Was his work clean and honest? If he passed, he was no longer an apprentice. He became a journeyman from the French journée, meaning a day's work. Now he could earn a daily wage for his labor, and crucially, he could travel. This was the great adventure. A journeyman butcher would pack his tools, his prized set of knives, and leave his hometown to work in other cities, learning new techniques, seeing how different guilds operated, and building his reputation. He was free, yet not fully his own master. He still worked in another man's shop, under another man's rules. The ultimate goal, the pinnacle of the medieval dream, was to become a master. To achieve this, he had to save a small fortune, enough to pay the exorbitant entrance fee to the guild, and to secure a lease on a shop on the row itself. Then came his masterpiece. Before the stern-faced guild masters, he would have to slaughter an animal and break it down into perfect, saleable cuts, demonstrating not just skill, but speed, efficiency, and minimal waste. His success meant more than a certificate, it meant a key. The key to his own stall, his own place in the fortress of the row. He could take on his own apprentices, vote in guild matters, and finally build the wealth that could lift his family name from the mire of the trade. It was a ladder climbed one bloody, slippery rung at a time, a lifetime's journey from the boy with the broom to the man behind the block, a king of his own crimson domain. That master's key to his own stall was also a key to the town's most volatile pressure point. The butcher row, for all its wealth and gilded power, existed on the edge of a knife. In times of plenty, the grumbling about prices was just background noise. But when harvests failed, when winters were long, or when war disrupted trade, that grumbling turned into a roar. The price of a loaf of bread was one thing, But the price of meat was something else entirely. It was the difference between strength and starvation, between a family meal and empty bellies. And the butchers, with their guild-enforced monopoly, controlled that price absolutely. In the public eye, they transformed from necessary providers into greedy hoarders, fattening themselves while children went hungry. The row ceased to be a marketplace and became a symbol of injustice, a fortress of food that common people could see but not afford. This was when the social contract, the uneasy tolerance for the butcher's trade, shattered. The narrow street became a theater for rage. A rumor would flash through the town that the butchers were holding back meat to drive prices higher, or that they were selling rotten meat at full price. A crowd would gather, not of shoppers, but of protesters. They were not there to haggle. They were there to demand. Often they would carry an empty pot or a wooden bowl, banging it with a spoon in a furious, rhythmic clamor that drowned out the sound of the cleavers. This was the cacophony of desperation. If their demands were ignored, the mood could turn in an instant. The first stone would fly, shattering a shop's wooden shutter. Then the dam broke. The crowd would surge forward, not to steal silver or coin, but to seize the very symbol of their deprivation. Sides of beef and whole hams would be torn from the hooks overhead. Barrels of salted pork were rolled out into the street and broken open. In their fury, the rioters were enacting a brutal, direct form of economic justice. They were taking what they believed was being unjustly withheld. The butchers, for all their bravado, would barricade themselves in their cellars or flee, their wealth and power useless against the tide of collective hunger. These meat riots were not random acts of vandalism, they were precise political acts. By targeting the butcher row, the rioters were attacking the most visible link in the chain of their suffering. They could not storm the lord's castle or the merchant's granary, but they could reach the shambles. Historical records from cities across Europe tell this same grim story. In one English town during a famine year, a mob seized control of the entire row and sold the meat back to the people at what they declared a just price, a penny for what had cost 3. In a French city, butchers were dragged from their shops and forced to swear oaths to lower their prices immediately. The row, so carefully placed on the geographical edge of town, found itself at the very center of social upheaval. These explosions of violence were a terrifying feedback loop. The looting would temporarily feed the hungry, but it also devastated the butchers. Their capital, quite literally, was eaten. It could take months or years for a shop to recover from such a loss. In response, the guilds would petition the town council for even stricter protections, for harsher punishments for rioters, and for the right to form their own armed watches to guard the row at night. This only deepened the divide, painting the butchers as a state-protected cartel against the people. So the butcher's block became more than a workplace, it was a barometer. The tension in the air on the row, the murmurs of the crowd, the speed with which prices rose, all of it measured the pressure building within the town itself. When that pressure burst, it did so not in the quiet council chambers, but in the open air, among the hanging carcasses and flowing gutters, where the fundamental equation of survival was written in blood and coin. The blood on their hands was a spiritual stain no amount of scrubbing could remove. In the eyes of the medieval church, the butcher's very livelihood placed his soul in perpetual danger. His work was a daily violation of the sanctity of life, a necessary evil that kept the community fed, but polluted the soul. This created a profound and personal tension for every man on the row. He provided the meat for the feast days, yet he was barred from taking communion if his hands were freshly bloodied. He was essential, yet eternally suspect. This relationship was a tightrope walk of rules and repentance. The most obvious conflict was the calendar. For over a third of the year, including every Friday, the season of Lent, and numerous other holy days, the church forbade the eating of meat from land animals. These were days of penance and reflection. For the butcher, there were days of economic paralysis. His row fell silent, his hooks stood empty, and his income vanished. Some butchers tried clever loopholes, arguing that beavers, because they lived in water, were actually fish. Others simply shifted to selling preserved meats they had salted months before, or turned to dealing in fish themselves, blurring the lines of their own guild's monopoly just to survive. The church's calendar dictated not just prayer, but the very rhythm of commerce on the blood-slicked stones. To atone for the moral hazard of their trade, successful butchers became some of the church's most generous and anxious patrons. They donated vast sums for the construction of side chapels within the great town churches, spaces known as chantry chapels. Here, a priest paid for by the butcher's own coin would say daily masses for the salvation of the butcher's soul and the souls of his family. It was a spiritual insurance policy purchased with pounds of flesh. Look closely at the stained glass windows in some medieval churches, and you might spot a humble ox or a lamb tucked into a corner, the subtle signature of the butcher who paid for that window, a quiet plea for mercy etched in colored light. Yet this charity could not always silence the preachers. From the pulpit, friars and priests would often deliver fiery sermons condemning the sins of the marketplace. The butcher was a frequent target. They were accused of the sin of greed, for hoarding meat to drive up prices while the poor starved. They were accused of cruelty, for causing unnecessary suffering to God's creatures in their haste to profit. One popular sermon of the time compared a dishonest butcher to the devil himself, carving up not animals, but the souls of the poor with his deceitful scales. Imagine standing in that congregation, a master butcher in your fine Sunday clothes, hearing your life's work described as a one-way path to damnation, all while knowing the priest himself likely enjoyed a fine cut of beef from your shop just the day before. It was a hypocrisy that must have burned, so the butcher lived in a state of sacred contradiction. He funded the very institution that questioned his place in God's order. He obeyed its complex dietary laws even as they threatened his livelihood. He built monuments to piety with the profits of a profession considered impure. This uneasy bargain reveals a deeper truth about medieval society. It could condemn a man's work while remaining utterly dependent on it. The butcher's soul was a battlefield where practical necessity warred with spiritual ideal, and his solution was to buy his way toward grace, one stone chapel at a time. This constant negotiation with heaven shaped his world as much as any guild law, forcing him to balance his ledger books with his very salvation. That master's key opened a door that still stands today. Walk down the shambles in the ancient city of York, England, and you are stepping directly onto the butcher row of the 15th century. The past is not buried here. It leans over you, creaking in the wind. The street is impossibly narrow, so tight that the timber-framed buildings on either side seem to bend toward each other, their upper floors jutting out over the cobbles as if sharing a secret. Centuries ago, this overhang, or jetty, served a grimly practical purpose. It created more space for living quarters above while maximizing the precious selling area at the shop front below. But it also meant that the carcasses hanging from the beams were protected from the rain and sun, and the close quarters kept the precious meat in cool shadow. Look up and you can almost see the ghosts of those iron hooks. The ground beneath your feet tells its own story. The cobblestones are worn smooth by countless footsteps and the daily sluicing of water, and if you look carefully, you can still find the central gutter, the kennel, that once ran with blood and wash water toward the nearby river Ouse. The street itself slopes gently downward, a deliberate design to aid that constant, grim flow. While the shops now sell fudge and magical wands to tourists, their very structure is a museum exhibit. The low, dark doorways that once led to cold storage cellars are still there. The great wooden beams, blackened with age, are the original bones of the butcher's stall. Even the street names in the area whisper of this history. You might walk from the Shambles onto Little Shambles, or find yourself on a lane called Flesh Shambles, a blunt and unromantic reminder of the street's true product. These preserved streets are not unique to York. In cities like Chester, Canterbury, and Norwich, you can find the same narrow, overhung lanes, the same palpable sense of a crowded, noisy, and pungent past pressed between ancient walls. Visiting them today is an eerie experience. The overwhelming stench is gone, replaced by the scent of baked goods and coffee. The cacophony of cleavers and haggling has faded into the murmur of tourists. But the architecture remains, a silent, powerful testimony. It allows us to physically inhabit the geography of the medieval world, to understand the claustrophobic scale, the ingenious use of space, and the sheer, unvarnished practicality of life. Standing in that narrow canyon of wood and plaster, you are not just learning about history, you are standing in its shadow, feeling the echo of 1,000 daily slaughters in the very air. These streets are the closest we can come to time travel, offering a visceral, unforgettable connection to the daily reality of the butcher's trade. A world built not for beauty, but for survival, and preserved by sheer, stubborn endurance. The shambles in York is not a lonely relic, but part of a vast, interconnected network. From the foggy ports of the Baltic to the sun-baked hills of Italy, every major medieval town carved out its own street of blood. The names changed with the language, but the reality was hauntingly familiar. In the bustling trade hubs of the German states, you would find the Metzgergasse, a word that translates simply and brutally to butcher alley. Walk down one of these narrow lanes in cities like Cologne or Frankfurt, and you would witness the same spectacle, the same overhead rails laden with meat, the same echoing thud of cleavers. The social structure was identical, too, governed by a powerful Metzgerzunft, a butcher's guild that controlled prices, quality, and membership with an iron fist. These men were just as wealthy and just as socially stained as their English counterparts, proving the pattern was not a local custom, but a fundamental urban principle. Travel southwest to the vibrant, chaotic markets of the Low Countries, and you would seek out the Rue des Bouchers, the Street of the Butchers. In Brussels, this famous lane still exists, a curved canyon of buildings where the overhanging upper floors seem to peer down at the street below, much like the shambles in York. Here, the Flemish butchers operated under the same strict guild rules, facing the same public health ordinances and the same simmering public resentment during times of scarcity. The geography was always a tell. These streets were inevitably found near a water source, a canal, or a river, to carry away the relentless waste. This was not a coincidence, it was a non-negotiable requirement for urban survival. Cross the Alps into the Italian city-states, centers of banking, art, and exquisite cuisine, and you would find the trade had its own distinct flavor, but the same essential bones. In Milan or Florence, you would look for the area called the Beccaria. This name comes from the Italian word beccaio, for butcher, and these districts were just as strategically placed on the urban map, often tucked behind the Grand Cathedral or Main Square, close to the riverbank. The Italian butchers' guilds, like the Art dei Beccai, were formidable political players, deeply woven into the complex fabric of city-state politics. Their wealth funded patronage, but their trade still marked them. Even in the land of Renaissance refinement, someone had to do the bloody work, and they were kept in their designated, pungent quarter. This remarkable consistency from York to Florence tells us something profound. The Butcher Row was not an English invention, or a German one, or an Italian one. It was a human solution to a universal problem. Whenever humans gathered in dense numbers, they faced the same logistical nightmare: how to feed thousands of people without poisoning them. The answer, arrived at independently across a continent, was always concentration and containment. Put all the slaughter in one place, downstream and downwind, and build a powerful guild to manage the chaos. This system recognized a hard truth, that society could not function without this trade, but it also could not bear to have its messiness spread throughout the city. So the Butcher's Row became a permanent fixture, a sacrifice zone that every growing town willingly created. It is a testament to a shared, pragmatic grimness that transcended kingdoms and languages. The street names might sound different to our ears, but to a medieval nose, they all smelled exactly the same, a universal signature of a thriving, messy, and deeply conflicted urban life. The same efficiency that made a body vanish could also hide a soul. For all its daily clamor, the Butcher Row held its deepest secrets in the quiet hours after dark, and it is in that silence that local folklore took root. Every town with a shambles seems to have spawned its own ghost story, a whispered tale passed down through generations, less about history and more about the enduring unease the street inspired. One common legend involves the apprentice who never left. The story goes that a young boy, perhaps one who saw something he shouldn't have or who angered his cruel master, simply disappeared one evening. His frantic family searched everywhere, but the butcher claimed the boy had run away. Life on the row continued, the cleavers falling, the gutters flowing. Yet, neighbors began to report strange sounds after midnight, a faint, rhythmic scraping coming from the master's cellar, like a broom pushing sawdust across a stone floor. Others swore they saw a pale, small face peering from the shop's upper window, though the room had been locked for years. The tale served as a grim warning about the dangers lurking in that closed world, where a missing person could be explained away as just another piece of waste carried off by the river. Another persistent strand of folklore connects butchers to the resurrection men, the grave robbers who supplied surgeons with cadavers. The story often features a butcher's cart seen rumbling through the churchyard gate in the dead of night, its driver a hulking silhouette. The next morning, a fresh grave would be found disturbingly empty, while the butcher's shop would have an unusual surplus of meat wrapped in heavy canvas, stored in the coldest part of the cellar. These tales played on the public's worst fears, that the man who dismembered animals for a living had no moral boundary preventing him from doing the same to humans, and that the tools of his trade could erase the evidence of a crime or a stolen corpse with terrifying ease. Then there are the phantom sounds. Even in towns where the Butcher Row has been sanitized into a quaint shopping lane, there are those who claim that on certain foggy nights, you can still hear it. Not the voices of people, but the sounds of the work itself. The distinct, solid thwack of a cleaver hitting a block, echoing from a wall where no shop remains. The slow, dragging sound of something heavy being pulled across cobblestones. The lowing of a frightened cow, cut suddenly short. These auditory ghosts are perhaps the most haunting, a sensory memory of the street's purpose etched into the very atmosphere, replaying the daily violence long after the blood has been washed away. These legends were never just campfire stories. They were the cultural residue of a very real anxiety. The butcher lived in a liminal space between life and death, cleanliness and filth, necessity and sin. His technical skill with a blade was both admirable and terrifying. Folklore provided a safe way to explore that terror, to ask the question the whole town was thinking, but dared not speak aloud in the daylight. If he can so expertly take apart a pig, what else might he take apart? And if he can make an entire animal disappear into cuts of meat and barrels of offal, what else could he make vanish? The ghost stories of the shambles are not about the past haunting the present. They are about the present's deepest fears haunting a place that never truly felt safe, even when it was bustling with customers. The mysteries of the missing were, in the end, a confession of the town's own complicity, relying on a man they could never fully trust, in a street they preferred to avoid after sunset. The ghost stories faded as the world grew brighter, cleaner, and colder. The Butcher Row, that fortress of stench and power, did not fall to a riot or a plague, but to a simple, revolutionary idea: cleanliness could be engineered. The first cracks in its ancient walls appeared with a new understanding of disease. For centuries, people accepted the miasma theory, the belief that sickness was carried by foul air. The stench of the shambles was not just unpleasant, it was literally seen as poisonous. But in the 19th century, scientists like Louis Pasteur proved that germs, not bad smells, caused illness. This changed everything. Suddenly, the open gutter running with blood was not just a nuisance, it was a biological hazard map, tracing a path of potential typhoid and cholera directly from the slaughter into the water supply. Public health reformers, armed with this new science, declared war on the old ways. They demanded covered sewers, municipal garbage collection, and clean running water. The Butcher Row, with its primitive kennel draining to the river, was an affront to this new vision of a sanitary city. One by one, towns passed laws forbidding slaughter within city limits. The abattoir was born, a centralized, regulated slaughterhouse built on the outskirts, far from homes and water sources. Here, animals could be processed under inspection, with waste managed properly. The daily symphony of death was moved offstage, out of sight and smell of the polite public. The butcher's shop on the high street remained, but it was now a clean, quiet retail space, selling meat that arrived already prepared, not born in blood on the premises. The visceral heart of the trade had been surgically removed from the town center. This physical separation was powered by a technological miracle: artificial cold. For millennia, meat was a fleeting commodity, sold and consumed within hours or preserved heavily with salt. The invention of mechanical refrigeration in the late 19th century broke the chains of immediacy. Now, meat could be slaughtered hundreds of miles away, chilled in railway cars, and delivered to shops days later, still fresh. The butcher no longer needed to be next to the river or the pasture. He just needed to be near a train station and have an icebox. This shattered the geographic logic of the row. A butcher could set up shop anywhere customers lived, no longer bound to the communal sewer of the shambles. The icebox in his shop, and later the electric refrigerator case, became a window into a frozen landscape of plenty, where cuts of meat lay neatly packaged on beds of ice, divorced from their animal origins. The overhead hook and the blood-stained block became relics, replaced by the white enamel and gleaming glass of modern hygiene. As the butchers scattered, so too did their ancient guild structure. The Industrial Revolution prized efficiency and scale over tradition and monopoly. New corporations could build massive packing plants in places like Chicago, using assembly line techniques that dwarfed the output of any guild. They could negotiate directly with railroads and sell to retailers nationwide, bypassing the local guild's control entirely. National laws regarding food safety and fair trade further eroded the guild's authority to set their own private rules. The Butchers' Guild, once a private government, became a ceremonial society or a simple trade association, its power to control prices, apprenticeships, and locations evaporating in the face of a connected, industrialized world. The Fortress of the Row was dismantled brick by brick, not by invaders, but by the currents of progress. The final transformation occurred not on a street, but under a single, vast roof. The supermarket, a 20th century invention, completed the consumer's journey away from the reality of meat. In the medieval shambles, you bought your meat from the man who killed the animal, in a space that reeked of the process. In a supermarket, you select a polystyrene tray wrapped in cling film from a brightly lit, odorless aisle. The product has been given a new, abstract name, a beef chuck roast or pork loin chops, words that bear no resemblance to the living creature. The blood, the sound, the skill, the entire narrative of the animal's transformation has been erased. This is the ultimate sanitization, a cognitive and sensory separation between the consumer and the consumed. The specialized street of blood has been replaced by a sterile corridor of convenience, and the butcher, once a powerful and stigmatized king of his domain, is now often just an employee in a white coat and hairnet, working behind a glass partition. We gained cleanliness, consistency, and year-round availability, but we lost the connection, for better and for worse, to the visceral truth of what it takes to turn life into food. The echo of the cleaver is now just a faint memory, buried under the hum of fluorescent lights and the gentle squeak of a shopping cart. Archaeology does not rely on ghost stories, it reads the bones. Beneath the modern streets and preserved timber frames, the true, gritty story of the Butcher Row is written in a language of soil and skeleton. When archaeologists peel back the layers of a medieval town, they are not just finding old trash, they are conducting a forensic investigation into daily life. Their most telling evidence comes from the humble midden, the town dump. In areas adjacent to known butcher rows, these refuse pits tell a dramatic tale. They are not filled with typical household waste. Instead, they contain dense, compacted layers of a very specific kind of filth. A dark, organic soil saturated with animal fat and blood, mixed with staggering quantities of bone. But these are not just random bones. They are almost exclusively the bones of domestic food animals, cattle, sheep, pigs, and goats, and they are broken in a very particular way. The long bones are split lengthwise, a technique used to extract the nutritious marrow inside. Skulls show precise impact points from the killing blow. The bones themselves are covered in a signature of the trade, fine, parallel cut marks from the butcher's knife, scars left from expertly separating muscle from bone. Each scratch is a moment frozen in time, a single stroke in the daily work of feeding a town. By analyzing these cut marks under magnification, specialists can even identify the type of tools used and the skill level of the butcher, distinguishing the hesitant gouge of an apprentice from the confident, smooth slice of a master. This bony archive confirms the historical records of specialization and guild-controlled skill. The sheer volume of bone found in these middens is itself a testament to the scale of the operation, quantifying the relentless consumption of a medieval urban population. Beyond the garbage, the very layout of the excavated foundations speaks volumes. Archaeologists mapping a former butcher row can see the ghostly outlines of the individual shops, their narrow frontages lining the street exactly as described in old property records. Behind these shops, they often find the remains of small, paved yards with central drains leading to the main street gutter. These were the slaughtering pits, the private stages where the first act of the drama took place before the carcass was brought to the front block. Sometimes they uncover the stone-lined cellars, their floors still sloping toward a drain, designed to keep the underground storage as dry and cool as possible. The placement of these foundations consistently follows the historical geography, clinging to the riverbank or sitting squarely downstream from the town's water source. This physical proof removes all doubt. The segregation was real, deliberate, and born from urgent necessity. Perhaps the most poignant finds are the small, personal items lost in the muck: a butcher's steel for sharpening his knife, a brass token from the guild, or a worn coin dropped between the cobbles. These objects connect the forensic data to the human hands that did the work. Archaeology thus performs a vital service. It verifies the whispers of history with the hard facts of the earth. It confirms that the Butcher Row was not an exaggeration of chroniclers, but a visceral, overwhelming reality. The stones and bones agree. This was a place of profound efficiency and profound mess, where the architecture of survival was built one cut and one carcass at a time. The bones tell us what was eaten, but history has forgotten how it smelled. Reconstructing the scent of the past is a new frontier, a field called sensory history, and it forces us to confront a truth our sanitized world obscures: smell was geography. The Butcher Row did not just have a bad odor, it possessed an atmosphere, a thick, layered fog that you didn't just smell with your nose. You felt it on your skin and tasted it at the back of your throat. Based on countless descriptions in town records, diaries, and court complaints, we can attempt to rebuild that olfactory assault. The primary note was copper, the sharp, metallic tang of fresh blood, gallons of it, spilled daily and soaking into the wooden blocks and the cobblestones. Overlaying that was the deeper, richer scent of raw meat and animal fat, a strangely sweet and heavy odor. Then came the decay. Within hours, especially in summer, the piles of offal, the intestines and lungs left in barrels, would begin to putrefy. This introduced a sweet, cloying, and profoundly nauseating smell, the scent of life unraveling at a molecular level, attracting swirling clouds of flies. Cutting through all of this was the acrid, chemical bite of lime, scattered liberally on the floors and in the gutters in a desperate, futile attempt to mask the stench and slow the rot. The result was a complex, ever-present perfume that announced the row from 3 streets away, a smell that clung to the wool of your cloak and lingered in your hair long after you'd left. This wasn't a passive background detail, it actively shaped human experience. It dictated where people walked, forcing anyone who could afford it to take longer, windward routes around the shambles. It influenced the time of day you shopped, with early morning offering the relative freshness of new slaughter, before the sun worked its magic on the waste. The smell created a powerful, instinctive social map, marking a clear boundary between the clean, refined center of town and its necessary, filthy engine room. More than sight or sound, this pervasive stench shaped memory itself. For a medieval person, the concept of their hometown would be inextricably linked to its signature smells: the baking bread, the tanner's vats, and above all, the butcher's row. To return from a journey was to be greeted by that familiar, unwelcome odor, a sensory confirmation you were home. It was a smell of vitality and horror, of community and exclusion, all bottled in the air they breathed. We have cleansed our world of such smells, but in doing so, we have lost a direct, visceral connection to the past, a dimension of history that was, quite literally, inescapable. The butcher's paradox was carved into the very walls of the cathedral. In the vibrant stained glass and illuminated prayer books of the wealthy, you might spot him, a humble, almost invisible figure in the background of a nativity scene. perhaps leading the ox to the stable. He was part of the scenery of ordinary life, a silent testament to God's creation. Yet in the same breath, medieval culture used him as a blunt instrument of moral instruction. In the popular morality plays performed in town squares, the character of the butcher was rarely a hero. He was a walking symbol of vice, his cleaver a metaphor for a cruel heart. He might be named greed or gluttony, his apron stained with sin as much as blood. A comic yet menacing figure who showed the audience the perils of a life consumed by base appetites and material gain. This was how society processed its deep discomfort, by turning the real man into a caricature, making his complex role into a simple lesson about the 7 deadly sins. Even in the luxurious pages of a book, like the Tres Riches Heures du Duc de Berry, a calendar made for a prince, the butcher appears in the scene for the month of December. He is shown in the act of slaughtering a boar, a necessary task for the winter feast, yet he is framed as part of the grim, bloody work of the season, contrasted with the elegant courtly life depicted in other months. He is factual, not celebrated, a piece of the annual cycle of survival. But for a richer, more human portrait, we must turn to the great storyteller of the medieval English world, Geoffrey Chaucer. In his Canterbury Tales, Chaucer does not give us a butcher, but he gives us the next best thing, a cook, and this cook, named Roger de Ware, is a figure straight from the shadow of the Butcher Row. He is described with a telling detail, a nasty, open ulcer on his shin. In the medieval mind, such sores were often seen as outward signs of inner corruption or unclean living. While he is a cook, not a butcher, his character is shrouded in the same mist of suspicion. He is accused of reheating old, leftover pies and selling them as fresh, a fraud that connects directly to the butcher's world of questionable meat and profit-seeking deceit. Chaucer's audience would have instantly understood the type, a man whose trade in food was tainted by dishonesty, a sibling in spirit to the greedy butcher of the morality plays. Through these artistic lenses, we see the cultural bargain in full view. The butcher was necessary in life, but useful in art as a warning. He could be acknowledged as a cog in the divine order of seasons and sustenance, yet simultaneously held up as a cautionary symbol of what happens when manual, bloody work is combined with the temptation of profit. This duality allowed people to consume his product while condemning his moral potential, to rely on his skill while believing they were spiritually superior to his trade. The stories and the stained glass were a release valve for societal anxiety, transforming a real, complicated neighbor into a manageable archetype, a figure in a story whose ending was always a lesson in virtue. The Butcher Row was never just a street, it was a perfect, pungent microcosm of the medieval world. Its existence answered not one question, but 4 interlocking necessities. First and foremost, it was a triumph of practical sanitation, a deliberate containment zone that sacrificed one street to protect an entire town from the biological hazard of its own hunger. By concentrating the blood and offal, channeling it to the river, and placing it downwind, towns performed a crude but effective form of urban surgery. Second, it was an engine of economic control. The physical clustering of every butcher created the fortress of the guild, allowing them to enforce standards, fix prices, and build staggering wealth from their monopoly over a fundamental need. Third, it was an act of profound social zoning. The row's location on the geographical and olfactory fringe reinforced a hierarchy that placed clean, quiet, valuable trades at the center, and the messy, mortal business of butchery at the edge, reflecting a deep desire to separate the refined from the raw. And finally, it was a mirror to the culture's soul, reflecting a spiritual anxiety about death and profit, a reliance on those it deemed unclean, and a storytelling need to turn the butcher into both a necessary provider and a cautionary symbol. These streets of blood and sawdust were therefore the medieval city in miniature, vital and vibrant, morally complex, and inescapably messy. They show us a society negotiating the hardest of bargains, accepting a profound unpleasantness as the price of collective survival. So the next time you walk through your own city or town, look beyond the modern storefronts and clean sidewalks, look at the layout of the streets, the names of the neighborhoods, the old buildings tucked between the new. Wonder what stories those stones could tell. Where did the necessary but unpleasant work happen? Where was the industrial quarter, the tannery, the gasworks? Every city has its own version of the Butcher Row, a place where practicality, profit, and public sentiment collided to shape the map. What do you think is the modern equivalent? Share your thoughts in the comments.